Hello, squad. I'm a broken-hearted liberal, and today we're here to talk about Braving Ruin.
Let's keep going. You sure? Yeah.
The political divide has grown rapidly in the last couple of years. People who were already committed to a particular leaning in the past have moved further to their respective side. But there's a particular gaggle of people, mostly found online, who have firmly declared themselves to be unaffiliated, the so-called centrists. And as the political divide continues to grow, they grow ever more smug, as though a widening political chasm is somehow making them stronger. But this couldn't be further from reality. For the last couple of decades, the center has effectively collapsed. The fact that this data ends in 2014 should really drive the point home. But in my travels through the various political discussion spheres of the internet, I quickly noticed something. Centrists never seem to be any less opinionated than anyone who chooses a more specific label, and I believe that this exposes a fundamental dishonesty. Centrists are those trumpeting the political horseshoe, loudly flexing the golden mean to make sure everyone knows how smart they are for not picking a side. The centrist, like any other politically engaged person, will inevitably have opinions of some kind, and will therefore have coordinate opinions which follow from the foundational ones. So their claim to centrism ultimately comes down to moderation. They will invariably fall towards one fitting label or another, but are unwilling to commit to that label for whatever reason.
Okay, so I think Braving Ruin here is essentially correct in that centrists generally will have a leaning, i.e. left or right. But the thing is, I think most centrists wouldn't say that they are truly neutral. Many will admit that they're either left-leaning or right-leaning. The thing is that they're essentially tired of the partisan politics, i.e. you'll have in one season Democrats being obstructionists, and then as soon as that flips around, the Republicans will be obstructionists. And that's tiring and exhausting. That's one of the reasons why independents have been growing steadily. Even if they lean one way or another, they no longer like being affiliated with the parties because of the obstructionism, the hypocrisy, all this other stuff that's associated with the parties. In addition to that, since 2004, there actually has been a slight increase in true swing voters.
Within each of the two main political wings, there are numerous specific positions one could take. Almost anyone at any point on the spectrum could handily pick a label to accurately describe their overall views, without having to wear the centrist mask.
One of the problems Braving Ruin with that is oftentimes you're not in control of the label. For instance, we saw this with the alt-right. As you no doubt have seen, the alt-right used to be a anti-PC sort of new right movement until it essentially got co-opted by the sort of white supremacist types like Richard Spencer and the like. And you see this with Milo Yiannopoulos, who used to identify as alt-right until it got co-opted, and now his previous comments can get pointed to and say, oh, you're alt-right, by people who don't know that there was a shift. So without having control over these particular labels, these labels can get co-opted. Now you're thinking, oh, but centrism is a label. Yes, it is, but it's a lot harder for centrism to get co-opted as a label. Now, centrism gets disparaged as sort of fence-sitting, but realistically, a extreme party will almost essentially never try to co-opt the word centrism, because it's not a term that you can essentially start to move away from the center with, because it is the center.
Even centrist political parties in the real world almost always sell themselves as center-left, center-right, or center-something, and will typically side with so-called extreme parties when a shared interest or belief happens to align. Or, in other words, the centrist is part of something greater than themselves, whether they'll openly admit to it or not. If a so-called moderate's true position aligns with and supports a more extreme position, what the centrist is willing to openly say or do becomes irrelevant. In some cases, this can even manifest as a conscious calculation, such as when a garden variety Democrat looks the other way from activists rioting in the street. They won't say they endorse it, but they won't condemn it either.
Okay, so first off, I identify as a left-leaning centrist, and I have condemned Antifa. I think Braving Ruin here is making a mistake by saying that the moderates are essentially the same as extremists. Because if you look at the extremes, if you look at Antifa and the alt-right, there is no way for Antifa and the alt-right to come to a common ground. There are polar opposites. There is no common ground. With centrists, there is some common ground. So for instance, I have a conservative friend and we talk on a regular basis. We've actually come to several compromises on several different issues. For instance, on voter IDs. Implement voter ID laws, but essentially provide IDs for everyone. And this is an example of centrists being able to come to a common ground. With the alt-right and Antifa, this is impossible.
It's convenient for them. It doesn't make much of a difference if someone is a moderate or devout believer in a grounding principle. If they agree on the fundamentals, then the minutia of whatever differences they do have will be eclipsed by the bigger picture, by shared interests and objectives. And so, in that broader context, you arrive at a distinction without a difference. None of this is meant to suggest that you can't respectfully disagree with political opponents. This is another commonly cited point of pride for centrists, but it seems both pretentious and, again, dishonest to try and claim a monopoly on civil discourse, as if to suggest that this is an impossible task for those who clearly state their allegiances. Even people who could be described as my sworn political enemies have granted me the pleasure of politely discussing our differences. But this in itself only reinforces my disdain for centrism. If being a centrist or moderate just means having the ability to engage in civil discussion, then I could personally point you to moderate anarcho-capitalists, moderate Trotskyists, and moderate National Socialists. See how silly that sounds? After all, you can't kind of be a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary.
Okay, again, so what Braving Ruin has done here is first he was saying that centrists will pick a side and that there's no distinction. And then he's essentially pivoting to focus on centrism being polite discourse only. Again, centrism is not just about polite discourse. It's about working with the other side if there's agreement. And again, Antifa and the alt-right will never work with each other, ever. There is no middle ground. There is no working with each other. That is the difference between centrism. It is not just, oh, you can have polite discourse. As Braving Ruin correctly points out, anybody can have polite discourse with anybody. The key is working with those people. That's the difference. People on the extremes will often try to separate centrists into one side or the other, and that's because centrists are a threat. Centrists are a threat to either side. That's why you have liberals get the bullet too. That's why you get comments like, if I had 2 bullets and a communist and a centrist in front of me, I'd put 2 bullets in the centrist. That's because a centrist is as much a threat as essentially a communist, regardless if they're a moderate right or a moderate left. That's because centrists aren't reliable allies. Reliable allies will always pick your side, i.e. the alt-right side or the Antifa side. However, when a centrist sees things wrong, i.e. if a centrist sees Antifa beating up people in the streets, or if a centrist sees an alt-righter beating somebody up in the streets, they're not going to stand for that. And that's precisely why people on the extremes will often try to separate centrists and divide them. It's the basic divide and conquer, i.e. either you're with us or against us. That's exactly what Antifa says. That's what some of the alt-right say. Oh, and one other thing, the Vox Day video I didn't think was a good enough quality, so I'm going to roll it into an overall video on Vox Day.